With me is Kevin McGinnell, who is deeply involved in Roman Catholic liturgical formation. The question that I want to put to him is, it's now 50 years after Vatican II. It's almost 50 years since the publication of the new liturgical books. Why do you think so many attitudes that don't fit with those liturgical books persisted from before the time of the Second Vatican Council?
Let me give you an example that springs to mind. There was an elderly priest in our deanery many years ago, and at one of our meetings we were asked, what do we find most difficult about being a priest? And he'd already been a priest for 50 years. And he said the most difficult thing he found was facing the people at Mass, which he did faithfully. He'd turned the altar around in his church, no problem, because he was faithful to the request of the church. So we said to him, why did you find this difficult? And he said, well, when I was trained to look at the wall and pray to God and let the people pray behind me. He said, I was told to pray without distraction. And now I look at the people and they become my distraction. He said, even his crucifixion. So I was struck then, because that wouldn't apply to many, many priests alive now, but it struck me that whole sense of what is your focus really means that you then determine everything else around you in that way. And I think many people who maintain different things, who've perhaps gone back to ad orientem in terms of celebrating the liturgy, who want black vestments for All Souls Day like we're celebrating today, they're hankering after a security that they think they will find in those actions or those things, but those things actually clash effectively with the very book that they're using. Another example, and I suppose I'm not trying to be too anecdotal, but I remember talking to another priest once who was challenging me about something I said we need to do. And he said, well, where do you get this from? It was about the breaking and sharing of bread. And I said, well, actually, Father, it's in the front of the missal, in the general instruction that you use every day when you celebrate. Because for many people, and I think it's true perhaps not just for priests, but also for many of the people who would want the simpler old form of liturgy, as they say, it's because that's what they knew, or that's what they've heard about, and they haven't bothered to look at the justification, the pastoral notes that are there in front of all of our liturgical texts, that to say to celebrate what is at the heart of the theology of this liturgy, we need to think about it this way.
Well, I would completely agree with that, and I would add to it that there's one of the problems of the pre-1970 rite was that it was actually a rite designed for an individual without a congregation. The rite was there for a priest with a single server answering, and then sometimes you just scaled up the number of people behind. And I think what happened was that the texts were changed. An old missal in one language was replaced by a new missal in another language, and with different jargon, but that a lot of clergy didn't realise the linguistic change was the least important. It was actually a completely different perspective from a rite that was essentially a medieval rite for monks. You actually had a community rite, which also happened to be in a different language. And I'm not sure that I think a lot of clergy were trained to follow rubrics, and then rubrics changed from time to time. There had been changes in rubrics. There is a myth that nothing changed, but the old Congregation of Rites used to be issuing new instructions all the time, changing this, that and the other. And so it was just taken for granted that this was just one more big batch of rubrics changes. And actually the whole theological understanding was far more dynamically changed than actually the rubrical change.
Somebody said very simply that we turned the altars around, but we didn't turn people's hearts and minds around. And there's a very good book that the Bishops' Conference produced on pastoral liturgy a few years ago, which was called With Hearts and Minds, and it was about trying to look at the celebration of Eucharist, and how do we actually do it so that we understand it intellectually, but also because liturgy is about the whole person, we actually have the same feeling for it. Another thing that I think is very important is to remember that, as you say, that liturgy that evolved from a medieval liturgy into the Tridentine liturgy belonged to a culture that is long gone. So, for instance, we've had to say to priests, well, if you want to celebrate the liturgy, say the Tridentine Mass in Latin, can you preach in Latin? Because you wouldn't do that with another language. And equally too, would you actually respect, for instance, even the Liturgy of the Hours belonging to that culture, which is a very complex way of praying on your own particularly. So I think there's a whole issue there about if we take liturgy as belonging to the whole person, then it's got to include all of us. It's got to include the way we live, the way we think, the way we feel, the way we know and understand. And if you only just change or stick with one bit, but don't actually leave yourself in a sense anachronistic because the rest of the world is moving forward and you move with it, then you're actually play acting to a certain extent. And that would be the worry that I would have. For instance, people using a language that they don't understand.
Well, I would actually I would completely agree with that, but I'd add another difference, and that is whether there is a very standard notion of the holy. It's a very ancient. It's found in Greece. It's found in Egypt, and it was given famously expression by Rudolf Otto, where he talks about the holy as the other. The holy is the distinct, and then there is a chasm between the holy and the ordinary. So, like Otto has this phrase, the ganz andere, the holy other, and it famously comes up in ancient Roman jargon. There's the usual word for a temple is a templum, but there's another word in Latin, fanum. And the fanum is the eerie. It's very much Otto's the other. It's almost a weird. And then the ordinary is the profanum, the outside the fanum. Now I think that idea, that very dualistic notion of the holy, when we talk about dualistic, we say, oh yeah, well that's a Gnostic notion. But I think it's deep in a lot of human language. Even after centuries of Christianity, it's still deep in the West because it was inherited from the classics, it was inherited in folklore, it was inherited in stories and fairy tales and whatever. And it certainly was played on in the Tridentine liturgy. There was the holy was defined by a language, rails. In the East, it's defined by an iconostasis. There's the ordinary, and then there's the other. Whereas there is another notion of the holy, and that's the notion of that's found in the idea that God created all. So somehow, even the human being, in their ordinariness, is the image of God. And to my mind, that long-term Jewish notion of the holy comes out in the idea of the incarnation. The holy is not the other. The holy is beside us. And I think one of the things about the difference between the two liturgies is the old fanum profanum binary notion of the holy, which I would ultimately see as elements of Gnosticism, has to be challenged by a radically incarnational notion that it's in the ordinary and a continuity between the most ordinary table and, say, the table of the Eucharist.
I'd agree with you totally. For me, for instance, when you mention the East and the Orthodox liturgy, or the Eastern liturgies, it is interesting there that the deacon and the priest will come out of the iconostasis and will wander round, and the people will be wandering in and out. There is a sense in which, while it is, yes, different and distinct, there's, if you want, a healthy, nearly disregard for it. We'll get on with it, we move around. Whereas what we have is, if nearly an Anglo-Saxon rigidity in the old form of the liturgy, which was you came in, you genuflected, you knelt, and you let it happen, and you were obedient to it in a sense. And I think this whole business of engagement. What does it mean to engage with the liturgy? I think another thing that is very true about, if you want, priests who want to return to that, who haven't even known it, is a real sense of, is this my security? Is this eternity contained in time and colour glass, as Betjeman says in one place? But it isn't. It isn't where we are in the world today.
Well, I think I would completely agree with that, but I'd also say that there's actually a call to conversion there. Is your notion of the holy derived from Rudolf Otto or John chapter 1?
Well, yes, and that lovely thing in the first letter of John, something we've heard, we've touched, we've seen,
absolutely,
and that's in a sense what we're trying to say to people, because if on earth what we're talking about is an anticipation of heaven, then what sort of heaven do you want?
Well, John was playing with the word for tabernacle. He doesn't say, he says, the word became flesh, the discourse took on flesh, and pitched its tent among us. And the pitching of the tent, he's assuming there the tabernacle, the old temple. But the old temple is now pitched in the middle of life.
And that's the word made flesh. And what we've got to talk about, I think, in our liturgy is incarnation. Not in any sense disregarding the divine, because that is where the divine is.
Let's leave it there.
Thank you.